Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, the deep and abiding irony of being lectured to by the National Party about the quality of one's coalition partners. This bill arose out of a misbegotten promise from that lot of deficit mongers with John Banks. And the reason that he won't be there to prop them up is he could well be in prison for lying about getting campaign donations from onekim.com. And as if life is not full of rich and enduring irony, one of their other coalition partners, the Honourable Peter Dunn, perhaps slightly more honourable than the Honourable John Banks, he's not going to be here because he leaked the paper about Kim.com, which has seen him lose his ministerial post, indirectly perhaps lose his party status, and just possibly lose his seat in the House. So imagine being told by that economic genius, the member who's just resumed his seat, that Labor has got a problem with its coalition partners. I'll take Russell Norman and the Greens any day of the week over the motley crew that bunch of deficit mongers has assembled over the years. And Mr. Speaker, Labor does not support this bill because it is a bill not about fiscal prudence. We have a proud record in fiscal prudence. We've never run a deficit in a decade. They've never run a surplus, New Zealand. This is a bill about who gets what. This is a bill that entrenches the primacy of monetarism over fiscal balance by making fiscal policy subservient to monetary policy. It's a bill that locks in low tax rates for the rich and erroneous GST for the poor by emphasising the stability, quote unquote, of tax rates. It's a bill that does nothing to fix Nationals' behaviour in giving away superannuation and making intergenerational theft worse. It's a bill that does nothing to fix the savings gap, the build-up of total international debt that makes New Zealand's current account deficit worse than Greece. So what would it take to have a real approach to fiscal responsibility? Upon which pillars does Labor's proud record of never having run a fiscal deficit rest? And it's very simple, sir. Firstly, genuine, prudent fiscal policy. Labor knows how to run a prudent book. National wouldn't know a surplus if it fell over one. In this year's budget, sir, they had to manufacture tax spikes to get within a bull's roar. They had to put off $200 million of spending they'd previously committed to. Not perhaps wrong in itself, but adding up with the other assumptions, absolutely ludicrous. They had to get their little filthy fingers in New Zealanders' back pockets by hanging on to their overwrought ACC surpluses. Sir, they had to put up petrol excise, and only having done all of that and more could they claw their way to a tiny little, paper-thin, imaginary $75 million, quote, surplus. And all the while, Mr. Speaker, New Zealand's total international debt rose and rose and rose, and our current account rose and rose and rose, because no one's explained to Bill English that it is not just his job to manage the government's books. It's his job to oversee the country's books. New Zealanders don't look to their government just to balance its accounts at the expense of their accounts. They expect a good government to be there for them and to grow the pie for everybody, not operate for their benefit against New Zealanders' benefit. You can't drive a fiscal surplus without having an economic surplus. That means having an economic growth plan founded on pro-growth tax reform, strong savings policy, sustainable superannuation, and real growth strategy right down to the regions and sectors. National has none of that. Their recipe has been putting off superannuation contributions, giving filthy tax cuts to their filthy rich mates, putting GST up on everybody else, and having an absence of economic strategy when it comes to growing the economy. It is shameful, and look at those members. I hope the TV cameras pan. You'll see them all hanging their heads, shuffling their feet. Paul Goldsmith, the new chairperson of the FEC, knows jolly well we're right. He's shuffling his feet. Now in putative protest, Margie Barry rises to her highest decitone. Mr. Speaker, it's a sad and motley crew over the way. Mr. Speaker, this bill introduces some very unfortunate biases that lock in who gets what, biases that actually ruin a history of bipartisanship on fiscal responsibility in favour of creeping bias for the rich. And here it is. Present and future generations they talk about, but they are the party that have dissed New Zealand superannuation. They make fiscal policy subservient to monetary policy because they require, in this bill, the writers of fiscal policy to have regard to monetary policy, but not the other way round. Now, what would be wrong, Mr. Speaker, with the Reserve Bank and those folks also at the Treasury who think about monetary issues actually having regard to fiscal settings and doing it? The answer at the Select Committee was, monetary policy is completely delegated. It's completely hands-off. Well, sir, no, it's not. There's a thing called the Policy Targets Agreement, which is written by the Minister of Finance, and he calls the Governor over for an explanation on how he's actually delivering on that. It's not completely delegated. It is should be, responsibly delegated. And, Mr. Speaker, the Reserve Bank Act itself is a creature of the government of the day, and the government of the day retains overall responsibility for money. Mr. Speaker, they don't like it. They don't like it because they know they're up an economic backwater without a paddle. Mr. Speaker, they're staring at their fourth deficit budget in a row. Their fifth next year. Fifth straight deficit in a row, and Labor had 9 straight surpluses. 9 straight fiscal surpluses and a higher growth rate. And Mr. Speaker, here's an enduring politics of New Zealand economics. Take a 30-year history of data, compare economic growth under Labor governments with national governments. Guess which comes out higher? Labor, by over 0.5% per annum, has a higher economic growth rate than under national governments. And as if that's not rich enough, sir, there's another lovely little statistic that goes with it, that despite that, sometimes business confidence is higher under national, and that's because it's purely tribal and because certain wealthy members of the community are able to rip off the system under national and feather their own nests. New Zealanders have had enough of it, sir. Mr. Speaker, we need to measure this bill by what is not in it, as well as what things are wrong in it. And, sir, here are some things that sadly are not in it. There is no reference in the bill to total national savings or total national debt, only to government savings. But government debt makes up only 15% of New Zealand's total national debt. The other 85% is private, and the bill ignores it, Mr. Speaker. And one cannot make sense of national debt without considering private debt. You know, it wasn't long ago, Mr. Speaker, that Bill English talked about rebalancing the economy. He doesn't now, because the economy is getting less and less balanced. Its current account deficit is growing. Its savings gap is worsening. Households are borrowing again as banks are pushing their risky money on people chasing a runaway housing market. Mr. Speaker, is it any wonder that National is going back to the same old, hands off and hope, let the economic car go up and down the roller coaster and see where it ends up? And, Mr. Speaker, passing sham bills like this one will do nothing to cover for National's lack of an economic plan.
That's right.
Doesn't matter how many glossy brochures Stephen Joyce fires out the back door of Moby.
Record of 50 years.
Their worst economic record in how many years, Dr. Clark?
50 years.
50 years. It's been said so often it must be true, Mr. Speaker. This is a sad bill. It's a sham. It's a waste of a good history of bipartisan cooperation.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with pleasure that I rise to